The telegram arrived at Xerxes Zimmerman's cattle ranch on a Tuesday morning in June 1884, carried by a rider who looked like he had crossed half of California without stopping, and it contained exactly 4 words that would change everything. Your grandfather left questions. Xerxes stood on the porch of his ranch house, reading those cryptic words 3 times before crumpling the paper in his fist. He was 26 years old, sunburned and strong from years of working cattle in the Mojave Desert, and he had never been a man for mysteries or philosophy. His life was straightforward, built on the simple rhythm of cattle drives, branding seasons, and the honest work of raising beef in one of the harshest landscapes California had to offer. The ranch sprawled across 800 acres of scrub brush and hardpan, watered by a temperamental creek that ran strong in spring and barely trickled by August. He had inherited it from his father 5 years ago, learned everything about cattle from his grandfather before that, and never imagined needing anything more than what he already knew. But apparently his grandfather, dead now 3 months, had left him something else entirely. The telegram was signed by a lawyer in San Francisco, a man named Cornelius Blackthorne, who insisted that Xerxes needed to come to the city to settle the estate. Xerxes had already received the deed to a small property in Mojave, California, a town he had only visited twice in his life, both times passing through on cattle drives. He could not imagine what questions his grandfather might have left, or why they required him to travel all the way to receive them. 2 weeks later, he stood in the lawyer's office overlooking Market Street, hat in his hands, listening to the most peculiar bequest he had ever heard. Your grandfather was a scholar in his youth, Cornelius said, adjusting his spectacles. Before he became a cattleman, he studied natural philosophy. He left you his research journals, his collection of geological specimens, and instructions that you deliver them to a Miss Catherine Flynn in Mojave. She is apparently the only person qualified to interpret his work. I raise cattle, Xerxes said slowly. I do not know anything about rocks or philosophy. Your grandfather was aware of that, Cornelius replied, which is precisely why he wanted you to meet Miss Flynn. He seemed to think you needed to expand your horizons. Xerxes wanted to argue that his horizons were already plenty expanded, stretching across 800 acres of California desert, but something in the lawyer's expression told him this was not negotiable. The will was clear. If he wanted to keep the property in Mojave, he had to deliver the materials to this Catherine Flynn personally. So he loaded 3 crates of journals, rock samples, and carefully wrapped specimens onto a wagon, left his foreman in charge of the ranch, and set out for Mojave with the kind of irritation that came from being manipulated by a dead man. The town of Mojave in 1884 was little more than a railroad stop with aspirations, a collection of buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the desert like survivors of a shipwreck. The Southern Pacific Railroad had come through 2 years earlier, bringing just enough commerce to keep the town alive, but not enough to make it prosper. Xerxes arrived on a blazing afternoon when the temperature had to be over 100 degrees, and he found the address the lawyer had given him without difficulty. It was not what he expected. Instead of a house or an office, the address led him to a small building on the edge of town that looked like it might have once been a church. A hand-painted sign over the door read, Mojave Natural History Survey, and through the open windows he could hear the sound of someone moving around inside. Xerxes knocked, waited, knocked again. It is open, a woman's voice called. He pushed through the door into a space that defied all his expectations. Every available surface was covered with specimens, maps, journals, and equipment he could not begin to identify. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes and jars. A large table dominated the center of the room, scattered with papers covered in handwriting and diagrams. The air smelled of dust, paper, and something faintly chemical. And standing at the table, examining what appeared to be a piece of rock through a magnifying glass, was Catherine Flynn. She was perhaps 24 or 25, tall and slender, wearing a practical cotton dress covered by a canvas apron stained with dirt and what might have been ink. Her dark hair was pulled back in a bun that looked like it was losing a battle with several escaped strands, and her hands were decidedly not those of a delicate lady. They were capable hands, marked with small scars and current dirt, the hands of someone who worked. She looked up when he entered, and he found himself looking into the most intensely curious pair of green eyes he had ever seen. "Can I help you?" she asked, setting down the magnifying glass. "I am looking for Catherine Flynn," he said. "You found her, and you are Xerxes Zimmerman. I have a delivery for you from my grandfather's estate." Her expression transformed immediately, curiosity turning to something that looked like excitement and grief mixed together. "You are Thomas Zimmerman's grandson. Oh, I am so very sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was a brilliant man and a dear friend. I have been waiting to hear from his lawyer for weeks." "You knew him well?" Xerxes asked, surprised. "We corresponded for 3 years," Catherine said. "He was one of the few people who took my work seriously. When I published my paper on desert geology in the Journal of Western Science, he wrote to me the next week. We have been collaborating ever since on a comprehensive survey of California mineral deposits." Xerxes tried to reconcile this image of his grandfather, the leathery cattleman who could rope a steer at 50 yards, with someone who published scientific papers and collaborated with young women researchers. "I did not know he was involved in science." "Most people did not," Catherine said gently. "He told me once that he kept it separate from his ranching life. He said cowboys did not take kindly to men who cared more about rocks than cattle prices." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You said you have his materials, the journals and specimens." 3 crates in my wagon outside." Her face lit up in a way that reminded Xerxes of Christmas morning when he was a child. 3 crates. "Oh, that is wonderful. I was afraid they might have been discarded. Would you mind bringing them in? I will clear some space." Over the next hour, Xerxes hauled the crates inside and watched as Catherine unpacked them with the kind of reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. She exclaimed over journals, carefully examined each specimen, and kept up a running commentary about the significance of various items that went completely over his head. "This is remarkable," she said, holding up a chunk of what looked like ordinary rock. "Do you see the crystalline structure here? Your grandfather found this in the Panamint Range 2 years ago. It suggests mineral deposits that could be scientifically significant." She looked at him with those intense green eyes. "Did he ever take you out on his surveys?" "No," Xerxes admitted. "I knew he took trips into the desert sometimes, but I thought he was just checking on grazing land or water sources. He never mentioned geology." Catherine's expression softened. "He talked about you often in his letters. He was very proud of you and the way you ran the ranch. But I think he worried you were limiting yourself to just one way of seeing the world." That stung a little, probably because it was true. "I see the world just fine. I see it practically. Cattle need water, grass, and good management. That is what matters." "And what about understanding why the water flows where it does?" Catherine asked, not argumentatively but with genuine curiosity. "Or knowing which areas have the minerals that make grass grow better? Science and practicality are not enemies, Mr. Zimmerman. They are partners." Xerxes wanted to disagree, but looking around at her organized chaos at the clear purpose and passion in her work, he found he could not quite formulate an argument. Instead he said, "You can call me Xerxes." She smiled, and it changed her whole face, making her look younger and somehow more formidable at the same time. "Then you should call me Catherine, or Kate, if you prefer. Most people do, though your grandfather always insisted on the full name. He said I had earned every syllable." "How did you get into this work?" he asked, surprising himself with his own curiosity. "It is not exactly common for a woman." "No, it is not," Catherine agreed, carefully placing a journal on a shelf. "My father was a surveyor for the railroad. He taught me mathematics and how to read maps before I was 8 years old. When he died, I was 14 and suddenly had no prospects except marriage or teaching, neither of which interested me. So I convinced the railroad to let me finish some of his incomplete surveys. I was good at it. Better than good, actually. I started noticing patterns in the geology, asking questions about why the land formed the way it did. That led me to books, which led me to correspondence with university professors, which eventually led me here. Here, to Mojave. I go where the questions are," she said simply. "Right now, the most interesting geological questions in California are in the desert regions. The formations here are unique, the mineral composition is fascinating, and almost nobody has done serious scientific study of it. So yes, here." She gestured around at her makeshift laboratory. "It is not a university position, and it certainly does not pay well, but the work is mine and it matters." Xerxes found himself looking at her with new respect. He understood that kind of determination, the willingness to build something from nothing in harsh conditions because you believed in it. That was exactly how he felt about his ranch. "Your grandfather's journals will help me complete the survey we started," Catherine continued. "He documented formations I have not been able to access yet. With his notes, I can write a comprehensive paper that might actually convince the geological societies back east that desert science is worth their attention." She paused, then looked at him with calculation in her eyes. "Can you read maps?" "Of course." "Can you handle yourself in the desert for extended periods?" "I have been doing it my whole life." "Then I have a proposition for you," Catherine said. "Your grandfather's notes reference several sites I need to visit to complete the survey. Some of them are in rough country, areas where traveling alone would not be advisable. I need someone who knows the desert and can manage the practical aspects of an extended expedition. You need to understand what your grandfather was trying to accomplish. We could help each other." Xerxes should have said no immediately. He had a ranch to run, cattle that needed him, a foreman who was capable but not meant to manage things indefinitely. But looking at Catherine Flynn, at the passion and intelligence radiating from her like heat from desert stone, he found himself considering it. How long would this expedition take? 3 weeks, perhaps 4. We would need to visit 6 sites between here and Death Valley, document the formations, collect samples, and verify your grandfather's observations. I have never been part of a scientific survey. And I have never had a partner who actually knows how to survive in the conditions we will face," Catherine countered. "Your grandfather thought we should work together. Maybe he knew something we do not yet. That decided it somehow. The old man had left him this peculiar inheritance for a reason, and Xerxes had never been one to walk away from a challenge, even one that involved rocks and questions instead of cattle and ropes. 3 weeks, he said. But I need to send word to my foreman first, make sure everything is arranged at the ranch. Catherine's smile was brilliant. Agreed. We will need a week to prepare anyway. I have to organize the equipment, plan our route, and arrange for supplies. Can you handle obtaining the horses and wagon we will need? That I can do. They shook hands on it. her grip firm and confident, and Xerxes walked out of the Mojave Natural History Survey feeling like he had just agreed to something that would change his life, though he could not have said exactly how. The week of preparation revealed just how different their worlds were. Xerxes approached the expedition with practical efficiency, arranging for sturdy horses, a reliable wagon, enough water barrels to see them through the desert crossings, and provisions that would keep in the heat. Catherine, meanwhile, filled crate after crate with equipment. Hammers and chisels for breaking rock samples, glass vials and jars for specimens, notebooks and pencils, a transit for surveying, reference books on geology and mineralogy, and a dozen other items Xerxes could not identify but which she assured him were essential. "We are not going to have room for water if you keep adding crates," he said on the third day, watching her carefully pack yet another box of glass containers. "We need these to properly document our findings," Catherine replied, completely unperturbed. "What good is discovering something remarkable if we cannot preserve evidence of it? What good is discovering something remarkable if we die of thirst before we can tell anyone about it?" She laughed at that, a genuine sound of amusement rather than offense. "Fair point. What if we compromise? I will reduce my specimen containers by 1 crate if you agree we can take my field microscope." "What in God's name do you need a microscope for in the desert?" "To examine crystalline structures in the field, of course. Some formations degrade quickly when exposed to air. We need to document them immediately." Xerxes was beginning to understand why his grandfather had enjoyed corresponding with this woman. She had an answer for everything, delivered with such complete confidence that arguing felt futile. "Fine. 1 microscope, 1 less crate of jars." They settled into a working rhythm during that week, meeting each day to coordinate their preparations. Xerxes learned that Catherine had a mind like a steel trap, remembering every detail of their plans and referring constantly to her meticulously organized notes. Catherine learned that Xerxes had the kind of practical competence that came from years of solving problems with limited resources in difficult conditions. She stopped questioning his judgments about equipment and supplies. He stopped rolling his eyes at her scientific instruments. On the evening before their departure, Xerxes found himself in the small boarding house where he had taken a room, cleaning his rifle and thinking about the expedition ahead. He was not entirely sure what had possessed him to agree to this. 3 weeks traveling through the desert with a woman he barely knew, looking at rocks and documenting formations, seemed like a peculiar way to honor his grandfather's memory. Yet something about it felt right in a way he could not articulate. There was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found Catherine standing there with a journal in her hands and an uncertain expression on her face. "I wanted to show you something," she said. "May I come in?" It was not entirely proper, but they were about to spend 3 weeks alone together in the desert, so conventional propriety seemed rather beside the point. Xerxes stepped back and let her enter. Catherine opened the journal, revealing pages of his grandfather's handwriting interspersed with sketches of rock formations and careful diagrams. "This is from 3 years ago, one of the first letters your grandfather sent me. Look at what he wrote here." She pointed to a passage and Xerxes read, "My grandson is the finest cattleman in California, but he sees only what is useful. I hope someday he learns to see what is beautiful, what is mysterious, what asks to be understood for no reason except that understanding itself is worthwhile. Perhaps you are the person who can teach him that." Xerxes felt something tighten in his chest. He wrote that 3 years ago. "Yes, I think he was planning this for a long time, Xerxes. This was not just about completing our survey. It was about showing you a different way of looking at the world." "I am not sure I needed a different way," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Catherine agreed. But perhaps he thought your life would be richer with one, and perhaps he was right. She closed the journal carefully. I just wanted you to know that this expedition means something to me beyond the science. Your grandfather believed in my work when almost nobody else did. Helping you understand what he loved about it feels like honoring him. I will try to keep an open mind, Xerxes said, and meant it. Catherine smiled. That is all anyone can ask. I will see you at dawn. After she left, Xerxes sat for a long time with his grandfather's words running through his mind. See what is beautiful, what is mysterious, what asks to be understood. It sounded like poetry, like impractical dreaming, but it had come from a man who successfully ran a cattle ranch while secretly pursuing scientific research. Maybe there was more room in a life than Xerxes had imagined. They departed Mojave at first light, the wagon loaded with supplies and equipment, 4 horses in harness and 2 riding mounts trailing behind. Catherine had dressed practically in riding clothes, her hair braided tightly back, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. She carried a notebook even on the wagon seat, occasionally jotting observations as they traveled. "Tell me about your ranch," she said after they had been traveling for an hour. "Your grandfather talked about it often, but I would like to hear it from you." So Xerxes found himself describing the spread of land northeast of Bakersfield, the challenges of finding water, the particular breed of cattle he favored for their ability to thrive on sparse desert grass. He talked about the seasons of ranching, the rhythm of calving and branding and drives to market. As he spoke, he realized how much love he had for that harsh landscape and the work it demanded. "You talk about it the way I talk about geology," Catherine observed. "Like it is not just work but something that matters deeply." "I suppose it is. My father built that ranch from nothing. My grandfather helped him. Now it is mine to maintain and improve. That feels important." "It is important," Catherine said firmly. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I just think there is room for more than one kind of important thing in the world." Their first survey site was a formation of exposed rock layers in the foothills east of Mojave, a place where ancient geology had been revealed by erosion. Catherine's excitement as they approached was palpable. She was out of the wagon almost before it stopped, her bag of tools over her shoulder, moving toward the formation with the focused intensity of a predator stalking prey. Xerxes watched as she examined the rock face, running her hands over the different colored layers, occasionally chipping off a small sample and examining it closely. She made notes constantly, sketched diagrams, measured angles with her transit. It should have been boring, watching someone tap at rocks for hours, but something about her complete absorption was fascinating. "Come look at this," she called eventually, waving him over. He climbed up beside her, and she pointed at a distinct line where the rock changed color dramatically. "See this boundary? This represents millions of years of geological time. Everything below this line was deposited when this area was under a shallow sea. Everything above it came after the sea retreated and the land began to rise. You are looking at the story of how California was formed, written in stone." Xerxes studied the line, trying to see what she saw. It was just a color change to him, brown rock becoming reddish rock. But the idea that it represented vast stretches of time, entire ages of the earth, was strangely compelling. "How do you know it was a sea?" he asked. Catherine's face lit up. "Because of these." She pointed at small shapes embedded in the rock. "Fossil shells. Marine creatures lived here once, died, and were preserved in sediment that eventually became stone. The evidence tells the story if you know how to rate it." She was right, he realized. There were tiny spiral shapes in the rock, unmistakably shells. Looking at them, Xerxes felt a strange dislocation. imagining this dry desert landscape covered by ocean water, teeming with life. Your grandfather understood how remarkable this was, Catherine continued. He helped me identify several sites where the fossil record is particularly clear. This is one of them. She pulled out his grandfather's journal, showing Xerxes a sketch that matched the formation before them almost exactly. He was here 2 years ago, made these drawings, collected samples. Now we are verifying his work and adding our own observations. They spent the rest of the day at that site, Catherine working with methodical precision while Xerxes set up their camp, tended the horses, and started a fire for the evening meal. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine finally packed up her equipment and joined him by the fire. "Successful day?" he asked, handing her a cup of coffee. "Very. Your grandfather's observations were precise. I found everything he documented and discovered some additional fossil beds he must not have had time to excavate." She sipped the coffee, sighed with satisfaction. "This is good. You are a man of unexpected talents, Xerxes Zimmerman. Making coffee over a campfire is hardly a talent. You would be surprised how many people cannot manage it without burning the beans or producing something that tastes like mud." She stretched, looking tired but content. "Thank you for doing this. I know it is not what you would have chosen on your own." "It is growing on me," he admitted. "I still think rocks are just rocks, but watching you work is interesting. You are good at this." "I am," she agreed without false modesty. "I have worked hard to be good at it. Women in science have to be twice as skilled to receive half the recognition." "That does not seem fair." "It is not. But fairness and reality are often different things. I learned that early." She stared into the fire. "My mother wanted me to marry a shopkeeper's son when I was 16. Nice boy, stable prospects, would have given me a comfortable life. But I could not stop thinking about the questions my father had taught me to ask. What makes rivers flow where they do? Why do mountains exist in some places but not others? How old is the earth really? Those questions felt more important than comfort. Do you ever regret it?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I regret the loneliness. Science can be an isolating field, especially for a woman, but I have never regretted choosing questions over comfort. The questions are what make life interesting." They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the desert night sounds around them. Xerxes found himself thinking that this was not so different from nights on the trail with cattle, except for the company. Most cowboys did not talk about ancient seas and the age of the earth. Most cowboys did not look at rocks and see stories written across millions of years. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a pattern. Days were spent traveling between survey sites, Catherine navigating by her carefully annotated maps, while Xerxes handled the practical challenges of desert travel. At each location, she would work for hours, sometimes an entire day, documenting formations and collecting samples while he maintained camp and explored the surrounding areas. Evenings they spent by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Xerxes found himself looking forward to those evening conversations. Catherine was brilliant, yes, but she was also funny and surprisingly down to earth for someone who spent her days thinking about geological epochs. She told stories about disastrous field expeditions, eccentric professors, and the politics of scientific journals with a wit that made him laugh out loud. In return, he found himself sharing stories about ranch life, about his father's death and the struggle to keep the ranch running, about his dreams of expanding the herd and improving the breeding stock. "You love your work as much as I love mine," Catherine said one evening. "We are not so different, you and I. We both found something worth dedicating our lives to." "Except cattle are useful," Xerxes said. "They feed people." And knowledge is not useful. Understanding the world does not feed people. Catherine's eyes flashed with passion. The mining companies are stripping these mountains for gold and silver without any understanding of the geology. They cause cave-ins, contaminate water sources, destroy valuable deposits because they are working blind. My research could help them work more safely and efficiently. That would feed people too, in its way. He had never thought about it like that. I suppose I always saw science as something separate from practical life. That is because people like me are not given the resources to prove how practical it can be, Catherine said. If I were a man with a university position, I could secure funding for projects that would directly benefit mining and agriculture. But as a woman working independently, I have to scrape by and hope that eventually my publications will speak loudly enough to change minds. They will, Xerxes said with sudden certainty. You are too good at this for people to ignore you forever. Catherine looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Thank you for that. It means more than you might think coming from you. Why from me specifically? Because you started this expedition thinking science was impractical nonsense, and now you are telling me my work matters. That is quite a transformation. Xerxes realized she was right. Somewhere over the past 2 weeks, his attitude had shifted fundamentally. He still did not fully understand geology, still saw the world primarily through a rancher's eyes, but he had come to appreciate Catherine's perspective. More than that, he had come to appreciate her. That realization brought others in its wake. He found himself watching her more closely, noticing the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the graceful efficiency of her movements, the passion in her voice when she explained some geological phenomenon. He noticed the way firelight played across her face in the evenings, the strength in her hands, the determination in the set of her jaw. He was developing feelings that went well beyond professional respect or even friendship. This complicated things considerably. The third site they visited was a canyon where exposed cliff faces revealed geological history in spectacular detail. Catherine spent an entire day rappelling down the canyon wall on ropes, examining the different strata up close, while Xerxes watched from above with his heart in his throat. She seemed completely fearless, trusting her equipment and her knowledge with absolute confidence. When she finally climbed back up as the sun was setting, she was covered in rock dust and grinning like a child on Christmas morning. That was incredible, she said, breathing hard from the climb. There are at least 30 distinct layers visible, representing different geological periods. I found evidence of volcanic activity, marine deposits, and terrestrial formations all in one location. This is exactly what I needed to complete the survey. You scared me half to death, Xerxes said before he could stop himself. Catherine's expression softened. I am sorry. I should have explained my safety measures better. I have been doing this kind of field work for years. I know how to manage the risks. I know you do. That does not mean I liked watching you dangle from a rope over a 100-foot drop. Were you worried about me? There was something in her voice, a tentative note that made him look at her more closely. Yes, he admitted. I was worried about you. They stood there in the fading light, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had spoken aloud. Catherine was the one who finally broke the silence. We should set up camp. It will be dark soon. That night, the conversation by the fire was different, charged with an awareness that had not been there before. They talked less about science and ranching, more about personal things. Catherine told him about her childhood, about a father who treated her like an intellectual equal, and a mother who never understood why that mattered. Xerxes talked about growing up torn between his grandfather's quiet encouragement to question and explore, and his father's practical insistence on the immediate demands of ranch life. "Your grandfather tried to give you permission to be both," Catherine said. "A practical man and a curious one. I think I am only now understanding that." "What will you do when we finish the survey?" she asked. "Go back to the ranch and forget all this?" "I do not think I could forget it if I tried." Xerxes looked at her across the fire. "You have changed how I see things, Kate. Not just rocks and geology, but everything. You have shown me there is more than one way to value the world." "That sounds like something your grandfather would say." "Maybe I am more like him than I realized." Catherine smiled, but there was sadness in it. "We have one more week together. Then you return to your cattle and I return to my research, and this becomes a memory." "Does it have to be that way?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. "What are you suggesting?" Xerxes was not entirely sure himself. He only knew that the thought of finishing this expedition and never seeing Catherine Flynn again felt wrong in a fundamental way. "I am suggesting that maybe we do not have to say goodbye when this is over. That maybe there is a way to keep working together, or at least to stay in each other's lives. You live 3 days' travel from Mojave. You have a ranch that needs constant attention. I have research that takes me all over the desert for months at a time. The logistics alone are daunting." "I know, but people have solved harder problems than logistics when they wanted something badly enough." "And do you want this?" Catherine asked quietly. "Want us?" "Because I need to know, Xerxes. I cannot afford to misunderstand what you are saying." He stood up, walked around the fire to where she sat, and crouched down so they were at eye level. "I am saying that somewhere over the past 3 weeks, I have fallen in love with you, with your mind and your passion and your courage. With the way you see questions everywhere and refuse to stop until you find answers. I am saying that I want to find a way to be part of your life, if you will let me." Catherine's breath caught. "I have loved you since the day you argued with me about water barrels and refused to be impressed by my credentials. Since you showed me that practical competence and intellectual curiosity are not opposites but complements." She reached out, touching his face with her dust-stained fingers. "But love and logistics are not the same thing. How do we make this work?" "I do not know yet," Xerxes admitted, "but I am willing to try if you are." She kissed him then, a fierce and tender joining that tasted of coffee and desert dust and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Catherine was crying. "I am willing to try," she whispered. "I am absolutely willing to try." They spent that night talking until the fire burned down to embers, working through the practical problems of building a life together across the distances that separated them. Xerxes suggested that he could hire another foreman, someone reliable enough to manage the ranch for longer periods while he joined Catherine on her field expeditions. Catherine pointed out that she could base herself in Bakersfield instead of Mojave, reducing the travel distance. They talked about combining her scientific knowledge with his practical ranching experience, using geological surveys to identify the best grazing lands and water sources. "Your grandfather would love this," Catherine said, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "He brought us together hoping we would learn from each other, and instead we fell in love." "Maybe he knew that would happen," Xerxes suggested. "He was a smart man." "Not that smart. Nobody could have predicted this." But over their final week of the survey, as they worked side by side documenting the last sites on Catherine's list, Xerxes came to believe that maybe his grandfather had seen something they had not. The way their skills complemented each other, Catherine's scientific precision and his practical problem-solving. The way they challenged each other to think differently without dismissing what the other valued. The way they fit together, intellectually and emotionally. and as they discovered in stolen moments of privacy, physically as well. Their last survey site was in the foothills west of Death Valley, a formation of twisted rock layers that Catherine said represented some kind of ancient tectonic upheaval. Xerxes had learned enough by then to see why it was interesting. The way the strata had been folded and compressed into impossible angles. Catherine worked with particular intensity that day, knowing it was her last chance to collect data for the survey. Xerxes helped her, having learned over the weeks how to chip samples properly, how to document locations precisely, how to assist without getting in the way. They worked well together, he realized. They had become a team. As the sun set on their final day in the field, Catherine stood looking at the twisted rocks with an expression of deep satisfaction. "We did it. We completed your grandfather's survey. Everything he hoped to document, we have documented. Everything he wanted to prove, we have proven. This is going to change how people understand California geology." "I am proud of you," Xerxes said. "I am proud of us," Catherine corrected. "You made this possible, not just the practical support, though that was essential, but you understood what this meant to me, why it mattered. That is not a small thing." They returned to Mojave 3 days later, sunburned and trail-worn and deeply in love. The question of what came next loomed large, but they had talked enough to have at least the outline of a plan. Xerxes would return to his ranch, settle affairs there, and find a foreman he could trust with extended responsibility. Catherine would write up the survey results and submit them for publication, while beginning to relocate her base of operations to Bakersfield. In 3 months, they would see if the life they had imagined was possible. The night before Xerxes was due to leave, they sat in Catherine's laboratory, surrounded by the carefully catalogued samples from their expedition. She had already begun organizing the data, her meticulous notes spread across the table in a pattern only she could fully understand. "I am going to miss you," she said, not looking up from her work. "I will be back in 3 months. 3 months is a long time. Then we will write letters every week, the way you and my grandfather did. We will document our thoughts and feelings with scientific precision." He was teasing, but also serious. Catherine finally looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. What if this does not work? What if the distance is too much? Or the practical problems are too difficult? Or we discover we only loved each other in the context of desert sunsets and shared work? Xerxes pulled her into his arms, feeling her lean into him with a trust that still amazed him. "Then we will have had something beautiful for a little while, and we will face whatever comes with the same courage you showed rappelling down that canyon wall. But I do not think that is what will happen. I think we are going to build something neither of us expected, something that combines your questions and my cattle and creates a life big enough for both. Between us, we build something neither expected," Catherine murmured against his chest. "Your grandfather would like that phrasing." "He would like you," Xerxes said. "He did like you from your letters. I think this is exactly what he hoped for when he left me that strange inheritance." They held each other as the desert night deepened around them, 2 people from different worlds finding common ground in love and mutual respect. When Xerxes finally left the next morning, Catherine gave him one of her notebooks, its pages filled with observations and sketches from their expedition. "So you do not forget what you learned," she said. He kissed her, long and deep, a promise and a commitment. "I could not forget if I tried." The 3 months that followed were both eternal and impossibly brief. Xerxes threw himself into ranch work, but everything felt different now. He looked at the land with new eyes, noticing geological features he had never paid attention to before, wondering what Catherine would make of the rock formations along his northern boundary. He found himself asking questions about why water collected in certain areas, what made some soil more productive than others, whether there might be practical applications for the kind of thinking Catherine had taught him. His foreman, a solid man named Robert who had worked the ranch for a decade, noticed the change immediately. "You are different since you came back from that trip," Robert observed one evening. "More thoughtful, less certain about things." "I met someone," Xerxes admitted. "Someone who showed me there are more ways to see the world than I realized." "This someone have a name, Catherine Flynn. She is a scientist, studies geology." Robert's eyebrows rose. "A woman scientist. That is unusual. She is an unusual woman." Xerxes found himself smiling just thinking about her. "And I am going to marry her if she will have me." "Well then," Robert said after a moment, "I suppose you will be needing someone to manage things while you court her properly." "I will need more than that. Kate's work takes her into the field for extended periods. I want to go with her sometimes, be part of what she does. Which means the ranch needs someone who can handle things independently." Robert considered this. "That is a lot of trust you would be placing in someone." "I know. But I also know that holding on too tightly to one piece of life means missing out on other pieces that might be equally important. My grandfather understood that. I am only now learning it." They spent the next months restructuring how the ranch operated, bringing in an assistant foreman, documenting procedures, creating systems that could function without Xerxes's constant presence. It was hard work, requiring him to let go of control in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. But every letter from Catherine strengthened his resolve. She wrote about her progress relocating to Bakersfield, the challenges of finding suitable workspace, the excitement of preparing her survey results for publication. She wrote about missing him, about lying awake at night remembering conversations by campfires and the feel of his hands on her skin. She wrote about her fears that they were building castles in the air, beautiful but insubstantial. Xerxes wrote back about learning to delegate, about seeing his land through her eyes, about his absolute certainty that what they had was real and worth fighting for. He wrote about love in plain, honest language that surprised him with its eloquence. 3 months to the day after he left Mojave, Xerxes rode back into town with a diamond ring in his saddlebag and a speech prepared. He found Catherine in her new laboratory in Bakersfield, a much larger space funded partly by a grant she had secured based on preliminary results from their survey. She looked up when he entered and her face transformed with joy. "You came back. I told you I would. I know, but part of me did not believe it. Part of me thought you would realize loving me was complicated and impractical and not worth the trouble." Xerxes crossed the room and kissed her, 3 months of missing her pouring into the contact. When they broke apart, he said, "Loving you is the least complicated thing in my life. Everything else is just logistics." "Just logistics," Catherine repeated, laughing, "as if logistics are simple." "They are when you know what you want." He pulled out the ring, watching her eyes widen. "I want to marry you, Catherine Flynn. I want to build a life that has room for both cattle and questions, for ranching and research, for all the things we both love, including each other. I want to see the world through your eyes and show you my world through mine. Will you marry me?" She was crying again, but also laughing, her brilliant mind apparently unable to formulate words. Finally, she just nodded, holding out her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she managed. "Yes to all of it. Yes to cattle and questions and building something neither of us expected. Yes to you, Xerxes Zimmerman." They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony in Bakersfield, attended by a strange mix of cowboys from Xerxes's ranch and scientists from Catherine's professional network. The combination should have been awkward, but somehow it worked, the two groups finding common ground in their affection for the couple and copious amounts of alcohol. Catherine wore a practical traveling dress rather than a traditional wedding gown, and Xerxes wore his best suit, and they promised each other not just love and fidelity, but continued curiosity, mutual support in their respective work, and the courage to keep building their unconventional life together. The first year of marriage was an adventure in negotiation and compromise. They established a pattern where Catherine would spend 3 weeks of every month on field work, with Xerxes accompanying her when he could and managing ranch business when he could not. The 4th week they spent together at the ranch, where Catherine began applying her geological knowledge to practical ranching problems. She identified areas where underground water was likely to accumulate based on rock formations, allowing Xerxes to dig wells in optimal locations. She analyzed soil composition and recommended which areas were best suited for different types of grazing. She even helped him negotiate with mining companies operating near his land, using her scientific expertise to ensure they did not contaminate his water sources. Xerxes, in turn, became Catherine's field partner and practical support. He handled logistics, managed camp, and kept her safe in rough country. He also became her sounding board, asking the kind of basic questions that sometimes led her to new insights. And he helped her translate her scientific findings into language that practical-minded ranchers and miners could understand and use. Their unconventional arrangement raised eyebrows in both the ranching and scientific communities, but it worked. Catherine published her comprehensive survey of California desert geology to significant acclaim, with generous acknowledgement of Thomas Zimmerman's foundational work and Xerxes's contributions to the field research. The paper established her as a serious scientist and led to consulting opportunities that actually paid well. Xerxes expanded his ranch's productivity, using Catherine's geological insights, and became known among other ranchers as someone who combined traditional knowledge with scientific thinking. He started hosting informal gatherings where Catherine would explain basic geology and how it related to water, soil, and grazing, translating her expertise into practical applications. In their 2nd year of marriage, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy but also anxiety about how a child would fit into their mobile, unconventional life. "I cannot do field work while heavily pregnant," she fretted, "and I do not want to stop working entirely." "Then we adjust," Xerxes said calmly. "You focus on writing and analysis during the late months of pregnancy and early months after the baby comes. I take on more of the field work using your training. We hire help at the ranch and with childcare. We solve the logistics because that is what we do." Their son was born in the spring of 1886, a healthy boy they named Thomas after Xerxes's grandfather. Watching Catherine hold their child, Xerxes felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the strange inheritance that had brought them together. "Your great-grandfather left me questions," he told the baby, "and those questions led me to your mother. Someday you will understand how remarkable that is." Thomas proved to be an adaptable child, seemingly content whether sleeping in a cradle at the ranch or a padded box in Catherine's field laboratory. As he grew, he absorbed both his parents' worlds, learning to identify rocks and fossils with the same facility he learned to recognize cattle brands and rope knots. By their 5th anniversary, Xerxes and Catherine had built something genuinely unique, a life that honored both their passions, that made room for both cattle and questions, practical work and scientific inquiry. The ranch prospered under Xerxes's management and Catherine's insights. Catherine's career flourished with Xerxes's support and partnership. Their son grew up understanding that the world was both a place to be worked and a mystery to be understood. They never forgot that it had all started with Thomas Zimmerman's peculiar bequest, his belief that his practical grandson needed to meet a woman who raised questions, and that between them, they might build something neither expected. On quiet evenings at the ranch, when Thomas was asleep and they had rare time alone together, Xerxes and Catherine would sometimes read from the old man's journals, finding new wisdom in observations he had made decades earlier. He knew what he was doing, Catherine said one such evening, turning pages filled with geological sketches and philosophical musings. Look at this entry from 6 months before he died. I have found the woman who can show Xerxes that questions are as important as answers. If I am very fortunate and they are both brave enough, they will find each other and build something remarkable together. He was an optimist, Xerxes said, but he was smiling. He was right, Catherine corrected. We did build something remarkable. A marriage that works despite breaking all conventional rules. A son who will grow up valuing both practicality and curiosity. A way of living that makes room for both our dreams. She leaned against Xerxes, and he wrapped his arm around her, thinking about how far they had come from that first awkward meeting in her makeshift laboratory. He had been so certain then about who he was and what he wanted. Catherine had shaken all that certainty and replaced it with something better. A life large enough for questions and cattle both, for science and ranching, for love and work, and the beautiful mystery of building a future together. Their 7th anniversary brought new changes. Catherine was pregnant again, and this time they had more infrastructure to support the adjustment. They had hired a full-time assistant for Catherine, a young woman fresh from college who was thrilled to work with someone who actually took women scientists seriously. They had also brought on a second foreman at the ranch, allowing Xerxes even more flexibility in his schedule. The pregnancy was harder this time, keeping Catherine closer to home through much of it. She fretted about falling behind in her work, until Xerxes pointed out that she had already accomplished more than most scientists did in a lifetime. You published groundbreaking research, established new methodologies for desert geology, and trained a whole generation of ranchers to think scientifically about their land, he reminded her. Taking a few months to grow our daughter is not falling behind. It is building our future in a different way. How do you know it will be a daughter? Catherine asked. I do not. But you have been carrying her differently than you carried Thomas, and the old wives at the ranch insist that means it is a girl. Catherine laughed. Since when do you put stock in old wives' tales? Since I married a scientist who taught me that traditional knowledge and careful observation sometimes point to the same truths. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born in the fall of 1888, a vigorous baby with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Thomas, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to show her rocks and tell her stories about the cattle. Watching his children grow, Xerxes sometimes thought about the life he might have had if his grandfather had not left him those cryptic questions. He would probably have married eventually, chosen some suitable woman from Bakersfield society, had children who grew up learning only ranching and never questioning the wider world. It would have been a good life, probably a happy one. But it would not have been this life, this rich and challenging and endlessly fascinating existence built between him and Catherine. It would not have had the depth that came from truly understanding and respecting your partner as an equal and a complement. It would not have had the joy of watching his children learn to see the world through both practical and scientific eyes. By the time Thomas was 10 and Elizabeth 7, both children were accomplished field assistants, able to help with geological surveys while also handling camp chores with competence. They had grown up traveling between the ranch and various field sites, learning that life could be lived in multiple ways simultaneously. Catherine had published 3 more major papers and was now consulting regularly with mining companies, railroad surveyors, and agricultural operations throughout California. Her work had practical impact, helping businesses operate more efficiently while protecting the environment she loved. She had also begun training other women in field methodology, determined to make science more accessible. Xerxes had expanded the ranch significantly, using profits from both cattle sales and Catherine's consulting work. He had become a leader in California ranching circles, known for his innovative approaches to water management and sustainable grazing. He regularly spoke at cattlemen's associations, always crediting his wife's scientific insights alongside traditional ranching wisdom. Their marriage had become a model of sorts, proof that 2 strong-willed people with different passions could build a life together if they truly respected what the other valued. Young women interested in science sought Catherine out, asking how she managed marriage and career. Young ranchers asked Xerxes how he had overcome his initial resistance to scientific thinking. The answers were always the same: love, respect, flexibility, and the willingness to keep building something neither had expected. On their 15th anniversary, Catherine surprised Xerxes by taking him back to the first survey site they had visited together, the formation with the ancient sea fossils. They left the children with trusted friends and made the journey like the expedition that had changed their lives. Standing at the same rock face where Catherine had first shown him fossil shells, Xerxes felt the full weight of everything those initial weeks had set in motion. "Do you remember what you told me here?" he asked. "About evidence telling stories if you know how to read it." "I remember everything about those weeks," Catherine said. "They were the most important of my life. Mine, too." He pulled her close, looking at the layered rocks that had once seemed so meaningless to him. "You taught me to read the evidence of my own heart. To see that loving you was not impractical or impossible, just different from what I had imagined. And that different could be better." Catherine kissed him, and it felt like a renewal of all the promises they had made 15 years earlier. "Your grandfather knew somehow. He knew we needed each other. He knew we could build something remarkable if we were brave enough to try." They spent that night camped under the stars, talking about everything they had accomplished and everything still ahead. Thomas was showing serious interest in veterinary medicine, wanting to combine scientific knowledge with practical animal care. Elizabeth was fascinated by mineralogy and had already published her first paper in a children's science journal at age 7. The ranch was thriving. Catherine's career was flourishing. Their life together had exceeded every expectation. "What questions are you raising now?" Xerxes asked, echoing the phrasing that had brought them together. Catherine thought about it. "I am wondering how far we can push this model we have built. Could we create an actual research institute that combines field science with practical application? Train a whole generation of scientists to think about real-world impact. Build something institutional that outlasts us. Between us, we could probably build exactly that," Xerxes said. "Neither of us expected to build a successful marriage or raise 2 remarkable children. An institute seems like the next logical step." She laughed. "Only you would call starting a scientific institute a logical next step. You made me a man who thinks in terms of questions and possibilities instead of just practical limitations. This is your fault. I will take that blame gladly." They returned from that anniversary trip with renewed energy and a new shared project. Over the next 3 years, They worked to establish the Zimmerman Institute for Applied Earth Sciences, based in Bakersfield but conducting field work throughout California. It combined Catherine's scientific rigor with Xerxes's practical focus on useful applications, training scientists to engage with ranchers, miners, farmers, and other people who worked directly with the land. The institute attracted funding from both academic sources and business interests, from people who saw the value in bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. It became Catherine's legacy, a way of ensuring that future generations would not have to choose between questions and usefulness the way she once had. Xerxes served as the Institute's business manager and practical liaison, using his reputation in ranching circles to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed to scientists. Together, they built something that truly served both their visions: rigorous science in service of real-world improvement. By their 20th anniversary, Thomas was studying at a veterinary college in San Francisco, and Elizabeth was the youngest undergraduate ever admitted to the geology program at Berkeley. The ranch operated smoothly under excellent management. The institute was training its second cohort of students. Xerxes and Catherine finally had time to slow down and appreciate what they had built. They took a long field expedition that summer, just the two of them, retracing the route of their first survey. They visited all the same sites, comparing current conditions to what they had documented 2 decades earlier. They made love under the desert stars the way they had when everything was new and uncertain. They talked about the past and the future and the remarkable present they had created. "I think your grandfather would be proud," Catherine said on their last night in the field. "We took his questions and built an entire life around them." "We built an entire world," Xerxes corrected. "A marriage, a family, a business, an institute." All because he knew that a cowboy who raised cattle needed to meet a woman who raised questions. "And between us, we built something neither expected," Catherine finished. "Though I am not sure that is true anymore. At this point, I expect us to accomplish remarkable things. It is what we do." Xerxes kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair, still amazed after 20 years that this extraordinary woman had chosen to build a life with him. "What is our next remarkable thing?" "I was thinking we could write a book together," Catherine said, "about the intersection of practical land management and geological science. Something accessible to regular ranchers and farmers, not just academics. Your grandfather's journals could be the foundation, combined with everything we have learned." "A book about questions and cattle," Xerxes said, smiling. "He would have loved that." They wrote that book over the next 2 years, working side by side the way they had done everything important in their lives. It was published in 1896, to surprising success, becoming a standard reference for ranchers, farmers, and land managers throughout the West. The dedication read, "To Thomas Zimmerman, who knew that questions and cattle both have value, and that between people who respect both, something remarkable can be built." Thomas graduated from veterinary college and returned to California to practice, combining traditional animal medicine with newer, scientific approaches. He married a fellow veterinarian, a woman as passionate about animals as he was about science, and they settled near the ranch to raise their own family. Elizabeth completed her doctorate in geology at 22, the youngest woman ever to do so, and immediately joined the faculty of the Zimmerman Institute. She specialized in water resources, using her mother's methodologies to help California communities find and manage groundwater more effectively. By their 25th anniversary, Xerxes and Catherine could look at the life they had built and see its ripples spreading out in every direction. Students trained by the Institute were changing how science was applied throughout the West. Their book had influenced an entire generation of land managers. Their children were building on their legacy in their own remarkable ways. And at the center of it all was their marriage, still strong and passionate after a quarter century, still built on mutual respect and the willingness to keep learning from each other. They celebrated that anniversary at the ranch, surrounded by family and friends from both their worlds. Scientists and cowboys mingled comfortably now. The division between those communities softened by years of the Zimmermans proving that both perspectives had value. During the party, Elizabeth stood up to make a toast. "My parents taught me that the world is full of questions worth asking, and that practical application gives those questions meaning. They showed me that you do not have to choose between head and heart, between thinking and doing, between love and work." They built something remarkable not just once but continuously, every day choosing each other and choosing to keep building. That is the legacy I hope to carry forward. Catherine was crying and Xerxes wrapped his arm around her, moved beyond words. Their children had understood. That was perhaps the greatest gift of all. As the party wound down and guests departed, Xerxes and Catherine found themselves alone on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over land they had shaped and been shaped by. "Are you happy?" Xerxes asked, a question he had asked 1,000 times over the years. "Profoundly," Catherine answered, her standard response. Then she added something new. "I sometimes think about the woman I would have been if your grandfather had not brought us together. A competent scientist, probably. Respected in my field eventually. But lonely, I think, missing this partnership even though I would never have known it was possible." "I would have been a successful rancher," Xerxes said, "made money, managed land well. But I would never have learned to see the world the way you taught me to see it, never have understood that questions can be as valuable as answers." "We saved each other from smaller lives," Catherine said. "We built something neither expected." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Two people who had spent 25 years proving that love could bridge any gap if both partners were willing to keep building. The ranch, the institute, the children, the book, the life they shared, all of it had grown from those first awkward weeks in the desert when a cowboy who raised cattle met a woman who raised questions. The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys. They watched Thomas and his wife build a successful veterinary practice and raise 3 children who inherited the family passion for both animals and science. They watched Elizabeth become the director of the Zimmerman Institute and train dozens of students in applied earth sciences. They published 2 more books together, each one exploring different aspects of how scientific thinking could improve practical land management. Xerxes turned 60 in 1908, Catherine 58, and they were both still working, still curious, still in love. The ranch had been passed to Thomas's management, though Xerxes remained involved in major decisions. The institute was firmly under Elizabeth's direction, though Catherine still taught occasionally and supervised field research. They had more time now for each other, for the simple pleasures of companionship that had sustained their marriage through all its complexities. They took long rides through the desert, Catherine still pointing out geological features and Xerxes still asking questions that pushed her thinking in new directions. They spent evenings reading to each other, discussing politics and science and family matters with the ease of people who had been partners for decades. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration that brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their work and their example. Scientists spoke about how the Zimmermans had changed their field. Ranchers talked about improved practices learned from Catherine's research. Former students described how seeing a successful marriage built on equality and mutual respect had changed their own expectations. During the speeches, Xerxes leaned over and whispered to Catherine, "They are making us sound like saints. Should we tell them about all the arguments we have had?" Catherine laughed quietly. "The arguments are part of why it works. Saints do not build real marriages. Stubborn people who refuse to give up on each other do." When it was his turn to speak, Xerxes kept it simple. 30 years ago, my grandfather left me an inheritance that made no sense. A bunch of rocks and journals and instructions to meet a woman I had never heard of. I thought he was crazy. Turns out he was the wisest man I have ever known. Catherine Flynn walked into my life and taught me that the questions we ask are as important as the work we do. Together we built something neither of us expected, a life big enough for both our dreams. That is all any marriage should be, and it is everything. Catherine added her own words. Xerxes taught me that questions without practical application are just abstractions. He showed me how to make my work matter in people's daily lives. More than that, he gave me partnership in every sense of the word. We have been equals in marriage, in work, in parenting, in everything that matters. That is rare enough to be remarkable and common enough that anyone willing to put in the work can achieve it. The celebration lasted into the night, and when it was finally over and they were alone again, Xerxes and Catherine walked out to look at the stars above the ranch. 30 years, Catherine said softly. It has gone so quickly. And we still have more to build, Xerxes replied. More questions to raise and cattle to manage and grandchildren to influence. She leaned into him, and he held her close, two people who had built an extraordinary life from an ordinary foundation of love, respect, and the willingness to keep trying. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over their first campfires together, and everything felt right. They lived another decade and more beyond that anniversary, continuing to work and love and build. Xerxes died peacefully at 71, Catherine at 69, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and the evidence of lives well lived. Their legacy lived on in the Zimmerman Institute, which continued training scientists to bridge the gap between theory and practice. It lived on in the ranching methods that Xerxes had pioneered, and Catherine had scientifically validated, now used throughout the western states. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, all of whom had inherited the belief that questions and practical work both had value, and that between people who respected both, remarkable things could be built. But perhaps most importantly, their legacy lived on in the example of their marriage itself. They had proven that two strong individuals with different passions could build a partnership that honored both their dreams, that love and respect could bridge any apparent divide, that between a cowboy who raised cattle and a woman who raised questions, something extraordinary could emerge. Years after both had passed, their great-granddaughter found Thomas Zimmerman's original journals in the Institute's archives. Reading them, she discovered the entry Catherine had shown Xerxes so long ago, the one where the old man had written about hoping his grandson would meet a woman who could show him that questions were as important as answers. But there was more. A final entry, written just days before Thomas Zimmerman died. I am leaving Xerxes my questions in the form of Kate Flynn, though he does not know it yet. I am gambling that he is enough my grandson to see past the inconvenience to the opportunity, to recognize that she offers not just knowledge but transformation. I am gambling that she is wise enough to see past his practical exterior to the curious mind underneath. If I am right, they will build something remarkable together. If I am wrong, at least they will have had the chance. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give the people we love is the opportunity to exceed our expectations. I expect great things from both of them. Reading those words, the great-granddaughter smiled, thinking of all the stories she had heard about her remarkable ancestors. The old man had been right. Xerxes and Catherine had exceeded every expectation, building not just a successful marriage but an entire world that combined their values and visions. Between a cowboy who raised cattle and a woman who raised questions, something neither expected had been built. A love story that transformed not just their lives but everyone they touched. A partnership that proved the power of respect and curiosity, and the courage to keep building even when the path was unclear. And it had all started with an inheritance of questions, delivered on a hot June day in 1884. That changed everything.